Some people click on this show looking for shortcuts because of the name, but in reality, the quickest way to success of any kind is following the rules better than anyone else. The problem is that those rules are probably not what you think. So my goal is to teach you how the system actually works so you stop inadvertently sabotaging yourself by breaking universal laws you didn't know existed. And that is the hack, because following these principles will correct the cognitive and emotional mistakes you make every single day. The impatience, self-deception, and short-term thinking that erode your chances of making substantial progress. If you're looking for a feel-good motivational video that'll charge your emotional state up through a cheap dopamine hit, you've come to the wrong place. That's not my style because it's not how real progress is made. That's why you've read all the self-help books and saved all the reels, but stay stuck in the same patterns. But not to worry. Over 100 years ago, one of the most disciplined and insightful business minds of history wrote a short but powerful summary of the invisible laws governing high-level success. What I'm sharing with you today comes from none other than John D. Rockefeller. Now, you've probably heard some bad things about him on the internet, but let's look at the advice he left to the next generation before you rush to judgment, because he had a lot of wisdom to share. Not just about getting rich, but about how people repeatedly incapacitate themselves by violating systems they don't understand. Today, we're breaking those laws down, not for business alone, but for anyone trying to build something that lasts. And he calls these principles the laws of high-class dealing. He wrote, "The underlying elements of success in business affairs is to follow the established laws of high-class dealing. So success depends on operating within established, time-tested rules. As you follow these rules, you don't have to be particularly intelligent or even innovative. You may occasionally have insightful ideas and clever solutions to complex problems, but the reason most people stay stuck is because they spend their time looking for novelty and shortcuts. There's nothing new under the sun, and the unfortunate reality is that most people miss their window of opportunity because it feels better to chase fantasies than to do things the right way. And there are right ways to operate within any system. Those rules already exist, whether you acknowledge them or not. Your advantage isn't in inventing new ones, but in understanding and applying the fundamentals better than anyone else. Because anything that grows by violating these laws eventually collapses under its own weight. Look at chess, for example. Most beginners think the way to win is with fancy openings and aggressive maneuvers that surprise their opponent. But those moves are pretty easy to defend once you understand the fundamentals of the game and have seen them a few times. So you don't really see grandmasters attacking with their queen in the first 3 moves, for example. You just see them playing really good chess and following the fundamental principles from opening to endgame. Likewise, if you want to compete with top players in any endeavor, which is the mindset you need to have, your strategy has to be built on principles that don't only work against beginners. High-class dealing is not etiquette or politeness. It's a way of operating that produces durable outcomes because it aligns with how systems, people, and markets actually work over time. These laws are not mysterious, and they're not even complicated. And that's exactly why no one follows them. They're simple but difficult and unglamorous, and you can't even recognize them until you begin to conquer your own impulsiveness and your habit of confusing motion with progress. By high-class dealing, Rockefeller meant operating in a way that survives time, pressure, and scrutiny. These laws begin with fair dealing, not as morality, but as strategy. When you do this, your reputation compounds and becomes leverage. Any advantage that relies on pressure, secrecy, or short-term imbalance eventually comes back to bite you. But when you deal fairly, you create situations where people want to work with you. They feel like they're winning by forming alliances with you and by giving you what you want. For example, in my business, I worked hard to build my value not around being the cheapest, but in going above and beyond to ensure that the structure of my offer and contract is just better than everyone else's. So I'm not competing on price or even experience, but fairness, so I can establish good long-term relationships. One of these laws is keeping to broad and sure lines and studying them to be certain they are the correct ones. What does he mean by that? Well, he's talking about how most people build their plans too narrowly. In other words, they rely on things needing to go right in order for them to work, like their mood, their energy, perfect timing, cooperative people, and other ideal conditions. But you're not trying to succeed on paper, unless you're a writer or a sketch artist, I guess. But that kind of strategy, it fails to account for the realities of life. A broad line is different. It's something that still works when you're tired, when people disappoint you, when conditions change, or when progress is slower than you expected, because it will be. Think about trust, preparation, conscientiousness, fairness, patience, integrity, accountability. Ladies. No, I'm kidding. Sort of. That strategy isn't flashy, but it keeps paying off in almost any situation. Think about it. If you go after any goal determined to win through developing the strongest character possible, you're playing a totally different game than anyone else. Like, I joined the Marines because I knew it would make me a different kind of person than I could ever become on my own. I wanted that to set me up for future success. I started in sales likewise because I wanted to learn how business worked. Neither of those things were about a specific outcome. They were about building something in me that would work anywhere. And yes, I picked up skills, but more important than that was the discipline, endurance, grace under pressure, the bearing, ability to deal with people, and to bounce back from failure. Those traits don't expire when conditions change. They don't depend on timing or luck. So when it's time to start a business, compete for a position, or produce something valuable, the only real question is whether I'm willing to put the work in, not whether I have the capacity to handle the pressure. A narrow line, on the other hand, is trying to squeeze a quick win and cut corners. It might work today, but it limits you tomorrow. Things like trying to replace competence with confidence, faking your way up the ladder, which is okay to a certain extent, like everybody does it. But if you don't use the opportunity gained from being confident to develop real skills, your entire position depends on an illusion. And the minute someone gets a whiff of bullshit, you're gonna be on real shaky ground. And when Rockefeller says to study these lines, to be careful that they are the correct ones, it means you don't just assume that your approach is solid because it feels right. Or some 20-year-old on TikTok said the same thing. Probably both heard it first from the same meme and forgot about it. But now it's repeated, so the recency bias is activated and you feel like it's everywhere. You need to test your theories against reality, which is impossible to do solely in your head. You need to experiment and get real feedback while also considering the long-term implications. Sounds simple, but no one actually thinks about the future. They just assume things will be better even though they're not actively moving towards anything. Newsflash. If you're not moving now, time won't get you anywhere except uglier and closer to the grave. So if a strategy only works when everything's lined up perfectly, it's not a sure line, it's a gamble. The next rule of high-class dealing is to watch the natural operations of trade and keep within them. And what he's saying is simple to understand but difficult to accomplish. Basically, every system has mechanics that don't care about your ambition, your effort, or your intentions. Markets move in patterns, careers move in patterns, creative fields move shockingly in patterns, and you don't get to override those mechanics. You either work with them or you get corrected by them. The best analogy I can give is that of a surfer. I love surfing and it actually has a lot of valuable life lessons. If you try to fight the ocean, you're gonna get beat up, maybe worse. You don't surf by forcing the waves and tides to bend to how you think they should behave, or by trying to dominate something that could easily crush you without even knowing. You surf by developing an understanding of nature and working within those operations to leverage its power. This applies to entrepreneurs, but it also applies to artists, athletes, and anyone trying to climb the corporate ladder as well. Supply, demand, incentives, timing, and trust all behave in pretty predictable ways. If there's no demand, effort won't save you. If the incentives are misaligned, your positive attitude just won't fix anything. If the timing is off, talent won't matter as much as you would like it to. You can align yourself with those forces or you can fight them, but fighting them always loses eventually. And let's not forget the negatives like pride, ego, greed, fear, lust, etc. Those aren't just moral failings, they're perception distorters. Pride makes you stop listening, so you miss signals that would have corrected you early. Ego ties your identity to a plan, so instead of adjusting, you defend it. Greed pushes you to overextend. Fear imprisons you. Lust, whether from sex, drugs, or rock and roll, pulls your attention towards what feels good now instead of what's sensible. All of them disconnect you and others from reality. They make you act as if the system should respond to your desires instead of the other way around. What really sucks is that life doesn't always punish you immediately. So you may develop a real momentum and habits in the wrong direction, so you've got to be careful. But remember, systems in general are built off of human psychology, out of how people think, what they value, what they tolerate, what they reward, what they ignore. You're not just developing a narrow lane of expertise. you also have to learn to swim in an ocean full of sharks, riptide, rocks, jellyfish, and of course, the dreaded kraken. If you don't understand the human element, you don't understand anything. And if you try to force outcomes without respecting the entire ecosystem, then the ocean, so to speak, is not what's going to break. This means reading the room before you try to move it. It's also understanding what's already in motion and positioning yourself so that your effort actually multiplies instead of getting wasted. The fourth law of high-class dealing is summed up by the statement, don't even think of temporary or sharp advantages. Don't waste your effort on a thing which ends in a petty triumph, unless you are satisfied with a life of petty success. I love that quote. So basically, you can think of this like scoring against a rival coworker in a meeting just to make him feel bad. But it just makes you look like a child in the process. It doesn't really accomplish anything. Or you have a client who implies you come from a different class of society, and it's more important for you to set him straight than to take his money. Come on. A lot of times you'll see either insecure, unstable people fall into this trap because they're paranoid, everyone's out to get them, and too impulsive to think things through, which ironically makes everyone hate them and out to get them. But you'll also see it with greedy people, those who can't let go of a few extra cents to make a dollar. He's not suggesting you don't act on short-term opportunities, just be careful not to win battles at the expense of the war. His next word of advice is to be sure that before you go into an enterprise, you see your way clear to a successful end. Look ahead. It is surprising how many bright businessmen go into important undertakings with little or no study of the controlling conditions they risk their all upon. So most people start things emotionally, not strategically. They fall in love with an idea, get sold a dream, or are charmed by the identity it gives them without ever asking whether the thing is actually finishable under real conditions. Sure, in a perfect world, we could all do anything that we set our minds to, but in reality, we have to be selective with the mission we choose to invest our time in. For example, I'm probably crafty enough to do well in politics, but I definitely don't have the patience for stupidity that I would need. And I feel the same way about corporations, by the way. Now, we'll talk about monetary costs in a minute, but what people fail to realize is the psychological and emotional toll required to achieve anything worthwhile. Right now, I'm working 8 to 5 and then coming home and knocking out 100 cold calls every single day. It's really not that hard to make any individual dial, but there's a huge mental hurdle to give up every evening to do work with no guaranteed benefit that no one wants to do anyway when there's a clear incentive. And I was in this situation a few years ago. At that time, I had more money in savings, fewer distractions, less responsibility. My skills were sharper. I was in a better headspace, but I underestimated how much making cold calls with zero oversight would suck. So, I didn't put in enough effort, honestly, because I had underestimated what it would take. I wasn't prepared, and that was the most expensive education I've ever received. Some pay for college, I paid to get experience, is what I tell myself. I made other mistakes there, but that whole venture cost about 40 grand. So everything I had and then some. I ran out of money and had to figure out something else, but after that, I started looking for experience in other areas of business besides sales. I took a major step down and worked at a bank for a while so I could get better with money and organization. I could learn accounting and in the process develop a higher tolerance for idiots. Then I went into operations management in the construction industry just to round out my skills I would need to handle what happens after the sale is closed. And now I'm back, ready for round 2, hopefully with a much clearer view of the path ahead. And as far as the emotional side goes, well, 1, I'm kind of dead inside. And honestly, depression and disassociation are an underrated life hack. Like, I never feel good, but I also rarely feel fear. And rejection doesn't faze me because I've already rejected myself. So I'm basically a machine right now. It's pretty cool. The point is, don't just ask if you can see yourself doing something. Ask if you can follow it through to the end after everything has gone wrong, because it will go wrong. And if the answer isn't clear, you don't have to force it. Like, I've wanted to go into business for myself since I was 20, but until recently, I kind of knew I wasn't ready. So instead, I did things that would give me the skills and experience that would force me to become somebody who was ready. I knew I had to strengthen my position before I could make the right move. And so far, I've followed through over the last decade, so I feel pretty confident that I can handle the next phase. So my 2 cents here, if the goal is worth committing to, but you're not ready for the full challenge yet, treat it like a game. Focus on leveling up incrementally. Don't quit the goal, just be strategic about how you approach it. Because following a progression of challenges that all lead to one specific mission is how you stay consistent over prolonged periods of time. And like I said, that last venture was an expensive lesson. Understand that I'm spinning it the best way possible because what else am I going to do? And that is what you should do when you have failures. But, big but, Rockefeller and myself are both advising that it's so much better to just avoid those mistakes in the first place. A lot of people have a very carefree, casual attitude and go, oh, well, it's okay because I learned. And yeah, of course you learned. Pain is a good teacher. That experience was extremely painful and it took years to undo that damage. Honestly, most people would have quit. Like, I was so broke afterwards that I kept myself fed by going to church groups and eating whatever food they put out. But it's one thing for me to say, think things through, and another for you to have the tools to do so, not to worry. Rockefeller answers this question in laws, dare I say, 6 and 7. The law of controlling conditions and its implication, and the law of capital sufficiency. Basically, every serious endeavor is decided by a few variables, not dozens. There's a lot of things that could happen, but there's a couple of things that will always happen and will always matter. Things like time, capital, demand, energy, competence, people. Oh, but I'm an artist. I'm an influencer. That doesn't apply to me. Really? You don't have to think about your ever fickle audience? You don't need to worry about the games agencies play to manipulate you and take your money? Also, remember that time is a silent killer. You are getting older, believe it or not. It's one thing to discipline yourself to work on something consistently, but time opens the window for things like economic crisis, health issues, breakups, or the start of new relationships and other major life changes. And it's hard to stay consistent when those things happen. Level 1 of dedication is where people quit because the skill itself is hard. Level 2, they quit because mastery requires tedious repetition and they get bored. Level 3, they're committed until controlling conditions, outside factors, make things more complicated. And that's where the law of capital sufficiency comes in. Obviously, if you're going to quit your job to chase a dream, you need to know what it costs to live and work for that length of time. But things never happen as soon as you would like. And it's not just about money, but also about sheer willpower, prolonged emotional stability, and skill. If you lack any of these, figure out how to fix it fast. Because law number 8, setbacks aren't bad luck. They are a guaranteed part of the process. If you don't have enough buffer to survive them, you weren't unlucky, you were unprepared. There's a principle in chess where you don't expect the opponent to make the move you want them to make, but instead you assume that they'll make the best move possible every single time. That way you can be prepared. High-class dealing means you don't ask whether something can work in perfect conditions. You ask whether it can survive reality. But people delude themselves and prefer to live in a fantasy world, which takes us to law number 9, the law of brutal self-honesty. You have to learn to walk the line between hyping yourself up to have the confidence to do hard things and staying grounded enough to recognize your shortcomings. Like, if you're only thinking about your last loss, you're going to be in the wrong headspace to win the next round. But if you're unable to recognize your responsibility and failure, you're not only doomed to repeat, but also to compound it. Most people are either too in their head, overanalyzing their mistakes and weaknesses to the point where they never take enough action to fix those problems, or they handle setbacks by overlooking the issue altogether. Both of those extremes are a mistake, obviously, but not so obviously at the same time. It's better to just learn to not take failure personally. You'll never totally separate your ego from your craft, but when you make it a goal, it does free you up to think critically about your performance and your decisions without getting discouraged. Because the only way to put in tens of thousands of reps at anything worth doing is to be both fully engaged in the process, but also detached from the outcome. And that's what it takes to become an expert in anything. And that's what you need to be aiming at if you want to win. Because other people are aiming at that, and they're going to beat you if you don't step up to the plate. They're going to beat you if you don't take things seriously. If you don't take life seriously, then you also won't be taken seriously. But that balance acts as both an antidote to denial, which is essential because the second you start lying to yourself about what's actually happening, you cut yourself off from the feedback that would have allowed you to improve. And the place to start with this self-honesty is the topics that you feel the most uncomfortable thinking about, regardless of how that threatens your identity and your self-image. Brutal self-honesty is not about being brutal to yourself. It just means seeing conditions as they are, not as you wish they were, or how they used to be, or how they need to be for your plan to make sense. Nowhere did I say to frame your mistakes in a negative light. You can still be optimistic about your ability to handle failure and improve. Just don't kid yourself that it's going to be easy. Don't overlook the challenge. And because it's so difficult, you need ambition. And I know you have it, or you wouldn't still be listening. It's okay to want more. Society tells you to be content with the status quo. I say fuck that. We can do better, and we know it. That's why we're working on ourselves, and we don't need to apologize for it. I don't want a bullshit degree designed for a conveyor belt student. I'll figure it out myself. I don't want the average relationship where my girl is never really mine because the back door is always open and I can't trust her to follow my lead anyway. I don't want the normal quality of life where the best I have to look forward to is Sunday afternoon football and being yelled at because I don't want to go thrifting on my day off after working an 80-hour work week. I don't want to bring the shit in my head to a therapist with no experience who only knows how to repeat the questions that I've already asked myself and to prescribe drugs because their only qualification is a liberal arts degree from a college sponsored by a pharmaceutical company. Ironically, probably the Rockefeller Foundation. But I think he's misunderstood. I really do. And I don't blame him for what his legacy has become. I think it's a tragedy, honestly. A tragedy of Erica Kirk proportions. If he knows, you knows. But all of this is rule number 10, the law of larger ambition. Money alone is too weak a motivator to sustain success. Greed won't get you through the dark night of the soul. And if it does, you've got bigger problems, honestly. But you can't truly live until you find what you're willing to die for. And you can find that in a spouse, family, community. But there's also more to life. It's good to win. It's good to be the best at something. Now, I'm turning 30 in a couple weeks, and this idea will apply to everyone, but I specifically would like to address people in their early 20s or so. As you pursue self-actualization, the journey develops a depth of character that just didn't exist before. So you start working out because you want to be hot, but after a while, you realize how much mentally stronger you are in everything else. So the gym becomes the place you train for life in general. You start martial arts because you're afraid of other people and you don't want to be. But after a year or two, you realize the strategies, discipline, patience, and humility that come from training have made you a better person overall. So the goals go from getting a black belt and big muscles to how can I find the limits of my potential? How far could I go? Who could I become? And I don't know about you, but I don't want to leave anything on the table. One day, you will stare death in the face, and the lies you've told yourself to excuse your fear, your weakness, and all the crap that you put up with, it will not be enough to soothe your agitated spirit. And maybe I'm fortunate to have experienced that early in life, but I'm telling you guys, take every day seriously. I'm just now at the point in my life where it's becoming obvious that for most of my peers, complacency and entropy have won. Even the ones who started off as high performers, because they lack the long-term ambition needed to keep them going. Because life is long. It's short, but it's also long, and it's hard. But I feel like I'm just getting warmed up. I'm not losing my edge at all. Actually, I've doubled down because I'm finally starting to see some of my effort compound. So whoever you are, but especially if you're young, ignore all the noise, all the shiny objects, all the sexy objects, and just focus on becoming a man or woman of integrity. Be diligent in the pursuit of excellence and prudent in your planning, and you will do well. So I'll close with Rockefeller's note on these laws. He says, there is no mystery in business success. The great industrial leaders have told again and again the plain and obvious fact. There can be no permanent success without fair dealing that leads to widespread confidence in the demand itself. And that is the real capital we all prize and work for. If you do each day's task successfully and stay naturally within these operations of commercial laws and keep your head clear, you will come out all right. Don't lose your head over a little success or grow impatient by a little failure. Thank you guys so much for listening. Be sure to share the episode with someone you think needs to hear it. Follow me on Instagram, socials, whatever, if you're not already. YouTube as well. The algorithm does not like me for some reason. If you guys have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. Instagram is probably the best way to get a hold of me. But thanks for listening. I will see you soon.